So,
Oh, here we are.
what's the program?
We've been exchanging some messages about um, Thich Nhat Hanh's quote um, that often gets, I think, shortened to "the next Buddha will be a Sangha," but was actually, I think, a bit longer and slightly more circumspect. It was something a bit more like, "It seems possible that the next Buddha may be Sangha."
Yes,
Yeah.
he probably said it a few different times in a
Maybe
few
he
different,
said it a few different ways.
yeah,
Well,
few different ways.
maybe he got
But
more confident in it as the years went on, or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, I think there was an element of that.
Yeah, sort of, you sort of speculate an idea and then sort of go, yeah, actually, I really can't see it being any other way,
Right, right,
after having speculated about it for a while,
exactly.
something that occurs initially as a possibility.
Mm.
And yeah, and so I'm very interested in what that looks like and um, what if any differences there are between the kind of collective um, like there's one model that something like simply what that means is that there will be some sangha somewhere that awakens and has Buddhahood, and
Mm.
they'll do that by doing the kinds of things that sanghas have been doing in terms of seated meditation and in terms of ethical practice and taking care of the space and so forth.
Mm.
Um, and then I guess where my interest has been on questions something like, is there something else that's required in order to is there a kind of collective meditation that
Mm.
that is needed that we don't yet that maybe hasn't yet been developed, like some kind of practice that allows people to form collective consciousness that would then be capable of awakening or something like that. So that's where some of my attention has been.
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, I want to add a couple of questions.
Mm.
So one is like a historical reflection. Like, was the original Buddha uh, maybe also a Sangha
Uh-huh.
in a sense? There's somehow like the myth has become quite, it sounds quite individualistic in that he
Right.
kind of went off into the jungle alone and then meditated alone and practiced mortification alone in a cave and got enlightened alone. And,
And then came back and said, "I'm awake."
yeah, yeah, but I'm kind of not, I don't know. I think that that's a certain, that's a take on the story and that's the kind of way that the story is being told. But there are aspects of the story, if you look at it in other ways, where you see that there were lots of kind of collective things in place to allow awakening
Mm.
to happen, including trees. That sounds maybe strange, but I don't know if you've read the Overstory, Richard Powers.
I have it, and I got about a chapter into it. I haven't
Right.
I haven't picked it up since then.
Yeah. Well, he kind of goes off the deep end at the end into a kind of actually it's quite a kind of techno enlightenment, a kind of not really AI, but a kind of internet like
Whoa. Okay. Cool.
magnetic
Cool. That
enlightenment.
gets me excited to dive
Yeah,
back
yeah.
into it.
It's quite cool, but there's this other aspect of it, which is a kind of, forest web enlightenment as well, where basically he kind of hints that the trees, when you kind of sit with them long enough, start talking to you, through their, through the molecules that they kind of emit through their bark and the pores, and so
Mm.
they're aware of you if you stay long enough, because obviously their time scale is longer.
Right.
And I mean, we know that this is at least to some extent true, that trees can kind of modulate, which chemicals they sort of put out into the atmosphere around them to affect the behavior of animals.
Mm.
Like if a tree gets, if its shoots get eaten by deer, then it releases a certain chemical that the deer don't like to stop it from
Right.
happening. And it also sends transmitter signals to other trees around so that they also emit the same molecule to put off the deer. So they
Yeah.
communicate. They do the same thing with parasitic insects and so on. So he's kind of speculating a little bit based on Suzanne Simard's work, but maybe they're talking to us, and maybe the tree actually kind of transmitted enlightenment to the Buddha in a sense. Obviously, that's kind of wildly speculative, but I don't know. There's something about that I also like, that resonates at a deep level.
Yeah.
So I don't really ask that question, to like seek like an explicit answer, but just to sort of put it out there, in the sense that, I just like to hold the question there in the space. Like maybe there's never been any such thing as an individual enlightenment, and that also at a deeper level goes along with the idea of no self. That
Right.
There's no individual enlightenment
Yeah,
anyway.
you certainly can't have an isolated individual get enlightened.
Right.
Well, for several reasons, but the first one being simply that you can't have one.
They wouldn't be able to breathe.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So there's that, and then there's also the culture that was in place at the time. There were the kind of economic shifts that were happening. There was the kind of, just there was a whole set of conditions that was necessary for, to allow somebody to engage in that process of going off into the forest and inquiring, into whether suffering could be eliminated or relieved, transformed in some way. And I kind of wonder if we are entering a similar kind of structure of feeling, in the sense of there's something in the air right now where like paradigms are in play again. It's like, it's not, we're still kind of in the dominant, physicalist, scientific materialist paradigm, but, chat GPT and things are kind of causing people to ask, like, hang on, but what about, what is consciousness? Am I just another chat GPT? Am I just
right. And lots of people like asserting that they know stuff about this that they sort of can't know.
Right.
Or that's just demonstrably false. Like they'll just be like, yeah, and then I'm just an LLM. And it's like, look, man, like when people invented steam engines, like people were saying that the brain was just a steam engine, and that seems really dumb right now. Like
Exactly.
you can't even imagine how somebody would possibly have said that.
Exactly. And yet we've always done that, in a sense, with whatever was the most advanced technology at hand has immediately become the metaphor for how we operate, including, I think you can even take that right back to the transition from, being hunter-gatherers to being farmers. We got interested in soil, and then we were like, oh, maybe we're made out of clay, Abrahamic religions, they started off with that. That was the best technology available. It was farming. So
right, it was like planting seeds and having them grow. Like
out of the earth. Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah,
and then you have hydraulics with the Greeks. You have the four humors, and then you have kind of clockwork with Descartes thinking that we're basically automata with springs. Modeled the nerves of springs.
Yeah.
Then you have Freud and the steam engine. It's like,
and I feel like at any phase in that, it's possible to. So, I mean, first of all, you can sort of have a more advanced metaphor, but it does feel like it's also possible to sort of release the grip of a metaphor a little bit and be more with the mystery of what we are. Like you sort of, at any era, you don't have to sort of be taking for granted that we're just like that. As like you can just sort of be like, well, we're something.
Yeah, I think mystery here is really key. And the metaphors are fine as long as we know that they're metaphors. And the problem at each point is that, if the metaphor becomes so dominant that it essentially does a disappearing act.
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of elides itself from our consciousness. So now it's very normal for people to apply the brain as computer metaphor as if it's unequivocal truth.
Right. And then they kind of do a sort of like Mont Bailey thing where they say, well, it's, brains literally compute. Brains are literally computers. And it's like, look, everybody today literally writes. But is everybody literally a writer? No, that has different connotations.
Exactly.
It means a different thing.
Exactly. And then they say things like, but, sense data, you're just processing sense data. Well, whoever said that, senses are giving you data? You're still in the metaphor. if you
Right,
say
right.
that.
And when I'm in touch with it more loosely, I can feel into something that's kind of like information theoretic about it. That like, you know, information theory still applies to both whatever computers are doing and whatever senses are doing. You can sort of
Right.
talk about flow of information or something, but you got to still be careful, I guess.
Yeah, I would even be careful with that one. I mean, you know, information theoretic frame is a powerful one, but I think it also the sort of the computer one is underneath it somewhere. And I would seek to kind of question the existence of something called information uh, as independent from
Oh,
consciousness, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, yeah, I've recently been going pretty far into a couple different kind of non-dual teachings.
Mm,
I guess like one of them is Sam Harris's waking up
yeah.
stuff. And then what are the others? This is one meditation by uh, Janusz, someone who it's sort of this like um, meditation on emptiness and the void. It's really, I found it really powerful. It's been one of the most effective guided meditations for me. And it's like basically like, okay, note, we're going to do some noting. You're going to note this.
Mm,
And this is everything you're experiencing right now.
yes.
And if you note this enough times, you might start to notice not this.
Mm,
It's like something other than everything you're experiencing. Somehow is also a thing you can be aware of.
right.
Like, yeah. Um, so that's been really neat. And then I guess a handful of other things, you know, books by different lamas or
Mm,
other people. Um, and non-duality. Yeah, and I feel like I'm getting a better taste of some sense of like of that.
mm,
I don't feel like my view has sort of inverted or that I'm having ongoing experiences of no self or whatever, but there's some increasing grasp of it. And I use the word grasp consciously because I think part of what I'm actually referring to here is I feel like I'm getting a deeper and deeper conceptual understanding of no self by
mm,
my left hemisphere as well. Like there's a
mhm.
kind of like I'm like, and I'm able to sort of reason about it. I'm like, wait a minute, but if we're all, if we're not separate, what does that imply? And I'm like, actually, like it's part of my thinking process. Like it's not sort of just a kind of floating, dangling, like I did 5-MeO DMT once, and now I'm like, I remember vividly that everything is one, but like I don't really know what that means. It sure seemed compelling at the time. It's more like, oh yeah, no, I mean, you can't. There's, there's no inside and outside. There's just this.
There's no boundary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting to explore both the kind of conceptual aspect of no self or of emptiness,
Mhm.
which is the same thing, but
Hmm.
and also the sort of the the direct experience of it, which is not the same as the conceptual understanding.
Mhm.
Um, but maybe we can come back to that. Yeah, if we come back to this sort of bigger question of individual and collective awakening,
Well,
I
I feel
just
like I've got a great segue
yeah, please
from the
go
one
for
to
it.
the other, which is that, you know, people talk about experiences of ego death or sort of like surrender, like surrendering to something larger, opening something larger. And like, I guess part of my whole history with this is I did a little bit of meditating in high school. Like you know, some random guided meditations I found and Eckhart Tolle and you know mindfulness based stress reduction course and stuff like that. But I didn't you know sort of conceive of myself as doing anything Buddhist per se. Um, and didn't have any of those kind of models or frameworks or lenses or paths in mind. And when I was and then when I was 20, I guess it was, I got involved in a scene that was doing a bunch of what I would later come to call collective awakening stuff, although at the time I was framing it in terms of collaborative culture. And in the course of being part of that, I had these experiences of my sense of self falling away and a sense of, but I think on some level I was not, it was not quite non-dual. It's more like I was identified with the group, but still not everything. And I was still identified.
Yeah.
And so that's been a point of inquiry for me for a while. It's like, what prompts people to do that? Because there is some sense in which we need to keep track of our individuality to sort out, like there are some, signals of like cold. I guess I should put on a sweater. Like, yeah, sure. I don't like try to put a sweater on you, like I need to keep track. Oh, that's my coldness. Okay. I gotta take care of that.
It's useful for getting on and off buses too. You don't like, being one with the bus could be problematic.
Yeah. You got a destination and so forth. And so, and this term individual is really quite lovely in a sense, in that it points at precisely, there is this point at which like you have to learn how to live with yourself, like very intimately. Everybody else you have to learn how to live with at some distance. You don't, you're still stuck in the same universe with them. I mean, unless we get into, murder and genocide and stuff like that, but preferably not, no. And even then you still got to live with the consequences of that and so forth, right? Like, but with yourself, like you're stuck with yourself. If you and I want, I want to work out and you want to take a nap, like there's an easy solution to that. I work out, you take a nap. If I want to do both things, it's not going to work very well. Anyway, so then also there is this thing that's like on a larger scale, if one group of people wants to have a conversation and another wants to go, go for a swim or something, then it's like the group can sort of split into two, and that's kind of cool. But if they need everybody, then they still have to sort of, in order to do whatever these activities are, then they have to somehow come to some sort of decision. And but then the fact that they may split is like very relevant. And so there is definitely a puzzle to sort out here of like, between the pragmatic aspects of having a self and organizing one's own stuff and the vast sense of being part of everything, there's a pragmatic question of with whom do you attempt to make life decisions? Yes. Well, both like big scale life decisions, but also like who do you choose to like have a conversation with and be navigating the question as we, for instance, are of what are we talking about and how? And, I generally choose to do this with people who speak English. Nothing against people who don't. But it's hard to have an interesting conversation with them, given that I'm not very fluent in any other language. Right. I know un peu français. Okay. But
on pourrait parler en français si tu veux, mais it might not work so well. Okay, well, maybe I can offer a couple of framings that might be helpful along the way.
Cool, yeah.
So one is something that we rely on a lot in Buddhist teaching, which is that there's kind of two levels of truth, which we refer to as the ultimate and the historical, also known as the absolute and the conventional. And there's various terms, and it's maybe interesting to line those up with some other things that are available sort of from Western framings. So David Bohm, the physicist, he had these two terms that he kind of coined, which is the implicate order and the explicate order. So according to him, this sense of the all being in the one, um, and this sort of holographic
Mm,
interpenetration of everything was what he described as the implicate order, um, but which is sort of hidden in a sense. It's not, and then what is manifest to us is the explicate order in which you are outside of me. You know, you are not me, I am not you, you're somewhere, I don't know where you are, on the west coast and I'm on the east coast. You know, I'm also not the computer. You know, there are distinctions, things can be named, you know, things can be identified and labeled and separated and categorized and so on.
mhm.
And in the implicate order, you see the kind of, yeah, the interdependence of all things. You know, you look into any one thing and you basically find a network of dependencies that goes back to, you know, that connects it to the entire cosmos. And
Right.
even from a single electron, you kind of need the whole cosmos to give rise to an electron. So
Right,
every
right. There's nowhere to talk about that electron from outside of it.
right,
Yeah, and it makes sense that Bohm would be thinking and talking about this because he's studying quantum mechanics. Like it's
exactly. And he
it's
was trying to find a way to sort of, he even found, he was exploring a new kind of mathematics that would basically, it was a kind of matrix multiplication operation that would take you from the explicate, that would sort of implicate things and enfold them into each other, into
mm,
the implicate, and then back. It was a kind of invertible matrix multiplication operation. I don't know how far he got with it, but
yeah, yeah.
anyway, so it's just a, you know, it's a nice parallel. And then but I think there are others. You could even look at something like vertical and horizontal theology. So that's, you know, these are terms in Christianity that kind of like the sacred in our relationship to the divine. We are in a kind of vertical relationship, and then in the horizontal is the kind of historical, you know, one thing happens after another, there is causality, and in the vertical it's kind of like all of eternity in the present
Mm,
moment, and
yeah.
the immanence of God in everything. And you know, so it just, and then you have someone like Ian McGilchrist giving you these two ways of bringing the world into being, of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, which sort of line up quite well as well. So you have the left hemisphere which kind of distinguishes particularities, which is very sort of focal, you know, which identifies specificity, individuality, which names, which categorizes, which labels, which
Totally.
instrumentalizes, and so on. And the right hemisphere, which sees more, you know, from the Gestalt,
Yeah,
and
more all at once.
exactly in a sort of resonant relationship of
Yeah.
open wonder and curiosity, is not afraid of kind of like paradox or apparent contradictions, and so on and so forth.
Right. It's just sort of
So
like, this seems to be true,
yeah,
and that seems to be true,
and
and
why not both?
it seems that they both can't be true. That
Right,
also seems true.
but that's okay. Yeah.
Hmm. This is an interesting situation I'm in, isn't it? Like,
There's a kind of comfort and ease with that. It's like,
yeah.
you know, the ease of sort of multi-layered metaphors just hanging implicit as well, not needing things to be collapsed or resolved.
Yeah.
So it seems like, you know, and then the one more that you could add is the sort of sacred and the profane, you know, there's, or the mundane and the ultra mundane, you know, all of these kind of pairings that we have in our cognitive toolbox in a way, I think are, if not absolutely identical, at least similar.
Hmm.
And one more I just want to throw in is, which has been interesting to me recently, is kind of mythos and logos. So,
Hmm.
you know, with logos, we want everything to be clear and precise and rational and sort of, you know, causal and sensible. We have the law of the excluded middle. You know, things either are or are not. They are true or not true, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then in the world of mythos, well, you know, all of that is kind of out of the window. But it's not less true. It's just differently true. Um, so if we come back for a moment to the Buddhist framework, um, there's a sense in which we have um, I okay, so well, I'll tell a story. So what, when I first encountered these teachings of ultimate and relative, or ultimate and historical, I interpreted them, and I think many do when they encounter Buddhism. I interpreted these as, in a sense, a kind of metaphysics. I thought what Buddhism was saying was the universe is literally two kinds of thing at the same time. So I was kind of trying to, what I didn't realize,
Oh,
you see what I mean?
yeah. I think I see what you're pointing at here, as opposed to these are two perspectives
Yes,
on everything.
right.
There's only one everything.
There's only one everything. It just manifests in two different ways according to how we perceive, to
Hmm.
somehow
Hmm.
some mode of perception which is in operation.
Yeah.
So that's more of a phenomenological truth rather than an ontological or a metaphysical truth. So I really have come to the position that Buddhism is essentially phenomenology and always has been. But when it first came to the West, it was interpreted under the sort of, through the lens of metaphysics, which is why we got it so completely wrong, and why we mistranslated a lot of terms and
Mm.
all kinds of stuff. Because if you go, it's like you go looking for nirvana as a kind of like, you know,
Salvation.
as either a state or a place or a time or some kind of
Mm.
event, some kind of brain state, something like that. Whereas maybe it's just an experience, like a way of seeing. And of course, if you are still in a physicalist paradigm,
That is a brain state.
that is a brain state, right? But what I'm saying is suspend the physicalist paradigm to the extent that we can, and maybe what is revealed is something quite different. And then the phenomenological approach becomes a kind of experimental method potentially.
Yeah. Um,
But the suspension of the physicalist paradigm is difficult, and maybe almost impossible for most of us who have grown up in the West. I think that's the thing that we really have to train in a way to release. And I believe, okay, I'm just going to throw this in as an aside and we can come back to it later, that is in fact the major obstacle to awakening,
mm.
whether individual or collective. So if we're going to talk about collective awakening, I think we can't avoid, at least from my point of view, what I'm seeing is that awakening cannot manifest as long as we are in the grip of the physicalist.
Mm. Do you see that as being more true of physicalism than, I don't know, like other kinds of dogmatism? Like, let's take sort of Christian fundamentalism as like a different
Mm,
kind of dogmatism.
maybe not. I think maybe what I'm advocating for is a kind of ultimate empiricism, in the
Yeah. Okay.
sense of
Yeah.
a kind of maximal epistemic humility, a kind of total anti-dogmatism, an ability to sort of meta yourself out of any frame of
Yeah.
reference. And I think that's the kind of mind training that Buddhism can offer. And when I say Buddhism, I'm not particularly attached to a kind of historical edifice.
Yeah. You mean
Um,
the Dharma as it is alive in any way that we can
exactly,
manifest it?
exactly, which includes incorporating new practices, new information, updating with whatever's available, including neuroscience, including trauma therapy, including body work, including somatic experiencing, whatever you want, like throw it in. If it works, it's good. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like I'm not, I don't like, no, we have
Yeah.
to stick to the original kind of Buddha Dharma. That's not what I mean when I say Buddhism. So maybe I shouldn't really use the word Buddhism,
Mm.
because
I mean, it would definitely mislead some people.
it would mislead some people. Yeah. And I think for
I,
most
you
of
know,
my
I
life,
met I met a person who said, like my parents were Buddhist, and I was like, what did that mean? And
yeah,
she's like,
it
well,
means a lot of
mostly they
different things.
celebrated a full moon festival or something like that. Like
Yeah,
every whatever we would go to the whatever is like what
yeah,
being Buddhist meant to them. And so it's like,
exactly.
the reality is that practices become cultures become like or something like there's a
Mm.
an
Yeah, there's an
evolutionary
evolution.
process. Yeah,
yeah, there's an accretion of cultural practices and values, and
yeah, and
yeah,
remixes and stuff. I've got
and
a bunch of things I want to say in response to what you
mm,
just laid out.
sure, sure, sure. I
Um,
just can I just add
yeah,
one more thing,
go for it.
because what I was trying to address was this question of the fluidity of identification and self.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I wanted to respond to these, the points that you were making about, like, you kind of do have to put on a sweater when you're cold. So that's kind of the ability. I think what also I misunderstood when I first encountered these teachings of ultimate and historical was I sort of thought, because of the way that they're translated and the word ultimate, it sounds like, oh well, that's
That's
the
the
one that's
real one.
true. That's the
Yeah, yeah,
real
yeah,
one.
yeah,
The
yeah,
other one
yeah.
is this kind of like contingent, stupid one that we've got to get rid of. It's all wrong. No, the whole point is what the saying is like two truths perfectly woven together. And if you want to find the ultimate, where did you go looking? You're in the historical. You go into the historical deeply enough, it becomes the ultimate.
Mm.
The one and the other depend on each other completely. There's no separating them. So I really, I even heard my teacher saying that, and I was like, yeah, 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 yeah. But what I want is the
I
ultimate.
want
Give me the ultimate one.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're very kind of addicted to to kind of peak experiences, and we want the kind of like the kind of CGI enlightenment experience.
Right.
But
Goku with his hair,
exactly. But I
yeah.
think what Buddhism, and again, I don't really want to use the word Buddhism, but what sort of practice, like optimal practice, invites us to do is to have fluidity, to be
Mhm.
able to move between these different ways of seeing
Right.
fluidly back and forth without getting
Yeah.
caught in the one. So when you need to get on the bus, you like, okay, the bus is there and I am here. I am not one with the bus. That would be very dangerous. You get on the bus, or when you put on the
Ow.
sweater. Ow,
Yeah.
yeah, owie. It's like not optimal. And yet you also have the ability to sort of touch into the ultimate at any moment, potentially,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe, you need a little bit more conditions, initially, more silence or stillness or something to be able to
Right.
do that reliably. But I think it becomes more fluid. And then my teacher identified what he called the third dimension, which is the action dimension. So he said, this is where the bodhisattvas live, basically between. So they've touched the ultimate, but they come back and they're like, oh, look, all these other people are definitely, they seem not to be very much in touch with the ultimate, and that's like, they seem to be really suffering. So I'm gonna hang around,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in the historical, and try to offer them ways to touch the ultimate, because they would enjoy their
Yeah.
lives a little more. So I think naturally they're making a slightly different point here about self, which is that I think if we really start to pay attention, our kind of identification mechanism is very fluid,
Right.
constantly
And that's fine. It
changing.
it
Yeah,
it
it's good.
shouldn't, it's not like it should be fixed at
No,
everything. And
no,
it shouldn't also, it also, people make a grave error when they fix it at me,
yeah,
not because they're illusorily thinking they're separate from everything else, but because they're thinking that they're more unified than they are.
right,
You
right,
know,
right, right,
they'll
exactly.
some thing will come out of their mouth. They'll be like, I know I need to do this, but I can't seem to make myself do it. And it's like,
Yeah. Hey, what's
okay,
that? The body parts?
who is stopping you
Yeah,
then?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
who is this not you that doesn't know that this is a good idea?
yeah,
What
yeah.
do they know? What do they think about things? Right? And but like, some random part just kind of
Mm,
grabs the mic and speaks as I.
right. It's remarkable, yeah, when we really start paying attention. And then in another direction, people say, well, I believe this, and it's like, well, do you, or have you just read it in a newspaper, or seen it on the internet? Or it's like the kind of permeability of what we think of ourselves,
Oh
I think,
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
much greater than we realize. Like the
yeah.
way that we are is essentially just ideas are flowing through us,
Yeah.
and we
I
claim
was
them and say I and mine, but
I was yesterday reflecting on a bunch of this in a long conversation about memes and cultural evolution,
mm,
how huge part of the current paradigm shift or phase shift that we're in, as I see it, um, which seems to me to be somehow connected with this next buddha-sangha thing,
yeah,
and also connected with the sense in which we are maybe in an age like the axial age when
yeah,
all these previous unfoldings were unfolding.
yeah,
And so one of the shifts as I see it is a shift in how we relate to memes, where the memes of the past just kind of flowed through us without us sort of really being aware of what we were doing.
mm,
Like it was just sort of like, well, yeah, this is how we do things here. Of course it is, and um, and that we've as societies, well, as society and as societies, because it hasn't been all one society the whole time. We've gone through various transition processes around like how we relate to memes, going from they have no justification, this is just how we do things, to oh no, but like we do things our way because we're right and we have the right God, unlike those people who are bad and have the wrong God and do things other ways which are bad. Um, to like various other kinds of justification, to the idea of objective truth,
mm,
um, which is a different kind of truth and a different kind of justification, and then puzzles about what objective morality might possibly mean, and then onwards into various and I could name all these in terms of spiral dynamics, but I
mhm.
will spare us. And where was I going with that? Right. So there's a shift to like, okay, well, where am I getting my ideas from, and why do I feel the need to propagate them? And getting a bit more space in that process so that it's not happening kind of reactively.
Yeah,
and and that combined with an understanding of something like karma might be the word for it. um and I am a bit confused about what karma is, but it seems at least related to some patterns that I've observed about how certain ways of trying to affect things sort of create tangles that
mm,
are all
yeah,
up on themselves. And then there's like some other ways that we can go about, again, trying to affect things. But because we're somethinging instead of somethinging else, it doesn't do the tangly thing. It instead does this
mm,
like fluid dance or whatever. And that basically in every moment, there's an opportunity to step out of the thing that's increasing the tangles and into a thing that is net, like untangling,
yeah,
something
yeah,
like that. Which is not to say that anybody always could notice what that opportunity is, but it seems that it in some sense always exists.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something which is trainable, which I think is a kind of um, this this ability to observe. So in a sense, what you're noticing is this shift from a kind of memes passing through us and us not even realizing that that's actually
Hmm.
what's happening, to sort of going, oh, hang on, there's such a thing as memes,
Right,
and
right, which is a very
yeah,
new concept, like it's only
which is
50 years
huge.
old.
Right. And then sort of one more step back from that is like, oh, and hang on, the memes are happening to me. And actually I haven't, there's a kind of element of choice here. Like I don't
Hmm.
have to propagate this idea. Like you were saying, introducing this a little moment of pause, of kind of less reactivity.
Hmm.
I think in essence, that's, I mean, the word mindfulness gets bandied around a lot these days, but I think that's an aspect of mindfulness, which is just a kind of noticing what is happening, which has a correlated increase of freedom, because then once you
Hmm.
know that it's happening, you could also say no to it. I mean, I think we're going to have to get into notions of freedom, because that has a lot to do with how we organize together in community or
Hmm.
not.
Hmm.
Um, but
Right.
I see, I really, really like Ian McGilchrist's framing, not so much of free will, but free won't. I just think that is sort of neuroanatomically much more sensible as well. That's what the frontal cortex seems to do. I mean,
Huh.
for a moment, diving into a sort of physicalist paradigm, but
Right.
just so we know,
Just
notice
tag
that
in
we
that a little
do.
bit. By the way, you totally got me earlier. It was very satisfying. You were like, Western Confucian thinking of nirvana as a brain state versus an experience. And I'm like, aren't those the same? And then you're like, which from a physicalist perspective, I'm like, eh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that was good.
Alert. But yeah, so there's a kind of a freedom to say no to an impulse to propagate a meme or to
Mhm.
else. There's a freedom to kind of go, oh, hang on, I don't actually have to do that if I don't want to. And I think that relates to karma as
Right.
well, because I mean, karma, in the literal translation just means action. So I think
Mm.
it's sort of accreted as well in the Western understanding of karma,
Right. All of these other, well,
a whole lot of other stuff.
and to what extent does that come from ways in which karma shows up in even like metaphysics other than the Buddhism that became a
Yeah,
metaphysics, right? Like I think
right.
karma is also in Hindu stuff,
Yeah,
maybe,
it
and like sort
pre-exists.
of.
Yeah,
And
it
I mean,
it predates Buddhism.
I've wondered greatly, sort of how much how much were various aspects of Buddhism influenced by. I mean, there's sort of two causal pathways. Like one causal pathway is whatever preconceptions the Buddha had or whatever going into everything he did. But I think I'm more even interested in just like all the preconceptions that everybody interpreting,
Also,
like
yeah,
anything he said sort of initially, right? Like all of the frames and lenses and the societal context and you know and like the various ways in which like society at the time kind of like Buddhism as a thing spread and got lots of people who were happy to call themselves Buddhist or at least were calling themselves Buddhist and didn't know you know, anything otherwise or whatever. But like the a lot of those people were not very connected with what we might call the Dharma or like the
mm,
actual sort of practice. Not
mm,
not totally unlike how you have large swaths of Christianity that are not connected with um, the mystical elements or the let's say something like uh, the teachings
mm.
as such or the practices.
Practices, I think,
Yeah,
is
is maybe
the
even.
difference. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, there's
yeah.
not a sense of cultivation necessarily.
Right. I mean, there's definitely Christianity as dogma, and even versions of Christianity where apparently all you have to do is just sort of say that you believe, and that's that. It's like just say it before you
Yeah,
die, and you're all good. That's kind of one extreme case.
yeah.
But I think there are strands of Christianity in there, few and far between. But basically, in the Orthodox sort of Christianity stream, there you can find the remains of a wisdom tradition
Mm.
and of a praxis, which is astonishingly similar in a sense to meditation practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing, like when you actually go and find the monks who still maintain these traditions. People talk about the heart prayer, and it's coming back. So there's kind of a Christian meditation movement that's kind of on the
Yeah, that
upswing.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're very much focused on practice and experience, direct experience of love and of kind of mystery and
Mm.
wonder rather than dogma.
Right, right.
So yeah, all of these things. But yeah, if we come back to the question of community, um, one of your early questions was what is needed? Like, is there
Mm.
something more needed in terms of practice? And I think in a sense, like my answer to that would be always yes. You know? And yet, uh, I don't think we necessarily need to sort of throw tradition out. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a it took me a long time to have any respect at all for tradition, because my upbringing was basically kind of like and so profoundly anti-dogmatic that if it's something that's been done by a lot of people and they say that you should do it, that's probably a reason for not doing it.
Right, right. And there's truth to that view, you know?
Yeah, it can be helpful, but sometimes the knife can cut you. So it's kind of like skepticism, yes, good, but test for yourself and do it honestly. Don't throw it out before you've actually tested it. So I'm interested in,
Right, which comes back to the empiricism thing.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and a sort of and a real honesty about that.
I found myself thinking a few months ago, as I tried to describe the work that I'm doing with collective intelligence and so forth, collective consciousness. I found myself coming around to this phrase of first person research.
Yeah.
So you can sort of argue that like something like science is third person research. Like it's the investigation of how things seem when and how things work, or sorry, it's the investigation of how things occur in domains where we can agree on the measurement apparatus. And where
in which there are measurables, yes, and
the
discussion of regularities in the measurables,
right, and I guess where I would say something like where the measurables are outside of us.
Appear to be.
Appear to be, but there's clearly something there.
Yeah, yeah.
Or something, right? Like, for instance, like in some. Well, actually, I've been learning. This is another thing that's been tripping me up with non-duality. Actually, is I was reading about the interface theory of perception.
Van Hoffman, or
yeah,
okay,
yeah. And so he makes this astonishing case that I watched a video of his. It was just like 5 minutes long, and I found it mostly trite and obvious. And then afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Like it was an interesting thing where it was just this tiny niggling of an idea. It's like what you're looking at is not reality as such. It is your interface with reality. That's all you've ever been looking at. And you necessarily sort of treat it as reality, and it's not weird for you to do so. Like, but if you, it's sort of like constructionism turned up to 11, right? Where was I going with that? Oh, okay. Anyway, so it could be that in some sense, aliens with a vastly different something might not even be able to agree with us on physics principles. Like they wouldn't disagree about how anything would go if we could have a conversation about it, right? Like if I hold this up and like let it go, like will it fall? They would expect the same thing to happen, except even finding a referent for this might be way weirder than we can imagine. Now, there might also be some convergent reasons why aliens would also evolve to have like 3D interfaces with the world. And perceptions of wavelengths and stuff. But yeah. So it's like you can think of all these measurement instruments as like things we put outside of us, but they're still measuring things in terms we understand.
Yes, so
in some sense,
I don't think there's any a priori reason to suppose that there would not be regularities that are in some sense measurable, even if we're not in a sort of physicalist world. Even if there is not such a thing as a completely independent external reality made up of particles obeying physical law, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't expect to see regularities, right? And sort of laws, in a sense, a structure. So Bernardo Kastrup does a really good job of this. So he's one of the big proponents of idealism right now. So this is why I think we're in a really interesting time. There's, there's the panpsychists and there's the idealists and there's Dan Hoffman doing his thing, and everybody's having a go, because there's this feeling like this paradigm is not working. Like there's some serious brokenness, and so
and part of that was, I mean, part of that is expanding popularity of things like Buddhism, but it seems like part of it was also like we really broke an assumption we didn't even realize we were making when physics got into relativism and quantum mechanics.
Yeah,
like there was a kind of like, oh yeah, we'll just put the system over there and study how it works. And then we're like, cool, now let's check which hole the photon goes through, because it should go through one hole or the other, right? Wait, it's doing something different,
whether I look at it or not. Yeah,
right. And it's sort of like
we seem to be involved somehow.
Well, the process of trying to answer the question is involved. I suspect it, in some sense, if you had, I don't know how. This is very confusing. Maybe I'm about to contradict myself, but I'm just going to entertain this train of thought for a moment. If you had two machines that would somehow randomly, maybe it's even quantum randomness, decide whether or not to measure the position of some particles on their way through the double slit, and both machines were set to destroy the answer to that question so that no sort of conscious being, such as a human, would ever see it, then I was attempting to ask the question, would it still affect the behavior? But I'm not sure you could measure that. Right. I haven't really thought this through. It might be that there is a way that you could sort of measure the metadata without measuring the... You know what I mean? Like, you don't get to find out which slit it went through. You just get to find out, did it do the blow thing? Like, did it do the interference pattern or not?
Right.
And I think you could measure that without ever getting to know which slit the thing went through.
Yeah, if you want to know which slit it went through, I think you inevitably have to interact with the...
Right. But what I'm saying is, like, you could devise a system that would prohibit a conscious being from knowing what slit it went through, but would still disturb the experiment. That seems pretty obvious.
Possibly. Yeah, I think so. By the
sort of, but not
very active measurement, even if it's not
recorded or like, yeah.
The measurement itself is an interaction. Which is the collapse of the wave function, according to the Copenhagen interpretation. But there are other interpretations, of course. But
right. You could say, I guess in a different interpretation, you might just still be in the universe where who knows.
Right. There's a kind of many worlds version of that.
Or you're in the world where it could have gone through either, but it definitely went through one or the other.
Right.
Not both, like, because you didn't get the interference pattern or something.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh yeah, that's weird.
But yeah, so I mean, I think what I think the kind of meta paradigm I'm interested in, I mean, if we come back to collective awakening, like what would facilitate collective awakening, I believe, is not so much replacing physicalism or a scientific materialist paradigm with another paradigm, but rather an attitude of this profound openness of mind, or anti-dogmatism, or an ability to be fluid with paradigms, and to potentially have no paradigm, at some very deep level. It's kind of like the view from nowhere. It's the understanding that any paradigm, any model that we make, any sort of framing that we make is necessarily putting us at a slight remove from direct experience, because the model automatically is kind of a compression, it's a projection, it's a reduction of the real thing.
Well, but from Don Hoffman's perspective, you simply can't do anything other than that, though, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I guess what he's saying
like it's one thing to have a paradigm, but like
well, yeah, representation has all of its other baggage, right? But you only have interface. Like you only have the point where your perspective, whatever a perspective is, makes contact with this.
Whatever that is.
I was
Yes.
almost going to call it that, but it's not just that, it's also this, right? Like it's not simply my perspective encounters other, it's my perspective encounters everything, me included.
Also, your perspective encounters your perspective, right?
It does do that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awareness of
And
awareness.
right. And then so yeah, finishing my earlier thought, I was starting to say something about science as third person research, and leaving aside the ways in which that might be confused, it's at least plausible. Like
Yeah.
it has been to many people, still is to many people. There's something about that. And I wanted to kind of like explore the notion of first person research,
Yes.
like rigorous investigation, not of how things are out there objectively, blah, 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 but rigorous investigation of how things seem and of the seeming process itself, like what it even means to be. And so this is then this phenomenological thing that you pointed at, right? And I sort of identified the moment I coined the term first person research, I was like, oh, Dharma is first person research, like rigorous investigation of the seeming process, the process by which things occur to us.
Yeah. So B. Allen Wallace talks about this a lot. First person science. So he and Dharma as, or meditation as, first person science, and I'm definitely of that view as well. This is also what I kind of teach, in a sense that we can consider any type of meditation in essence to be an experiment in the laboratory of our own direct experience. I would kind of like take, I would question the word seems, what seems, and from what is out there, because I think all we have is the apparent seeming, and it's not seeming, it is like that. Like the experience,
it is simply a being and a knowing.
The experience is reality. Like that is what we have. And so even for Donald Hoffman, I'm kind of like, I don't know.
Feel like I felt like he's making an error like the one you're describing as well.
I think he's adding a kind of a whole architecture behind direct experience that, whilst logically I can follow his argument, obviously, but I just don't think that it's necessary to. Well, I think there's more. There's more that can be explored by suspending even that kind of.
Right. Being fixated on, yes, I'm just experiencing my interface has a kind of, you're now conceiving of interfaceness. Like when he refers to the, like one of the metaphors he uses is like, when you move a file on your computer, you're like dragging this icon, and he sort of says, is the file, actually like green just because it's a spreadsheet? And it's like
skeuomorphism.
Right.
Exactly.
And
I think then you're kind of adding conceptual baggage, which is
right. It's interesting, but the way that we experience reality is not purely, even if it is an interface, it is not solely symbolic, although it also sometimes is. Someone goes to draw a face and they're like making big lines around the different face parts, and completely forgetting like these little shadows and like, all these other things because they don't have parts. Right. And then drawing on the right side of the brain and all of that stuff. So we can make symbolic interface with the world, but we can also make a kind of non-symbolic interface with the world.
This is what is more interesting to me. So I think we've been kind of colonized a little bit by our left hemisphere mode of apprehension of the world, to such an extent that language, and I don't mean just words, but I mean, in a sense, any kind of conceptual framing, including mathematics, has again done this disappearing act where we have conflated, the map with the territory. So, you know, you can easily, you know, anybody gets like the map is not the territory. Anybody understands like, okay, yeah, I know the word is not the thing. But then, you know, I've had discussions with people on Twitter about this recently because, you know, with ChatGPT, the kind of, it's in the air, you know, it's like, what is ChatGPT doing? Is it just, you know, matrix multiplication? Or does it have any kind of ability to ground itself? Does it have anything that you could call experience? I personally don't think so. You know, would it have would it becoming, if it becomes multimodal, does that give it sensory grounding? I still don't think so, because
Right,
underneath
right.
that, you still have
Ultimately,
matrix multiplication, you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And so I think when ChatGPT or any of the you know, DALI or Midjourney or the other ones, like when they apparently see or draw, they're not seeing, like they've only been trained on data sets of images with text, right, with descriptions, right? All of the training happened with images that had description. So ultimately what they are seeing is language.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. So that they're right. There's some
Yeah.
sort of mapping being produced from image to description. Right.
Yes.
I
They
mean,
don't have the image, they just have the map, which is, and then people kind of say, yeah, but you know, I get it's a projection, you know, but it's good enough. You know, language, maybe language is a very good mapping of reality. Maybe you can kind of infer, you know, the true nature of reality from language. Maybe you can infer, you know, I saw somebody saying that it's inferred chemistry, or, you know, it hasn't. It
well,
hasn't.
it seems like it has inferred some structures.
It may well have, and possibly some very good ones, but it's lossy, massively lossy. I just think like language inherently, also mathematics, is of a different order than direct experience. It is, it's like, okay, let's just do an experiment right now. Let's take the content of our visual field. Just look at it, just like not just the focal content, but the whole thing. If I gave you a year and a cabin in Alaska to write down and describe to me the contents of your visual field just in this one moment, I don't think you could do it. And you could do a very good job, but it would be incomplete. You wouldn't be able to get everything.
Right. It's sort of like there's a sense in which like part of what you're pointing at is like a picture's worth 1,000 words is in some sense like way too few orders of magnitude.
Yes. So I'll give you another example. Like, let's imagine that you've never eaten a kiwi.
Right. But like, how would you describe what a kiwi tastes like that would give someone the experience of eating a kiwi? And moreover,
between those two things is so vast. You know, I could write tomes about like, it's kind of sour, but it's sweet, it's green, it's hairy, but not really, but it's quite
right.
nice.
So this comes back to the perspective thing as well. And it relates to what it means to something like have a collective perspective on something. I've been staring at this a bunch, and I recorded a YouTube video recently that was I was looking at something pretty. I think it was a sunset, you know, but it was a sunset is like, you know, it's a category, right? Like does not tell you in some sense anything about it. I was looking at something pretty and I recorded a video entirely of my face. And I said, I'm having an experience of right now. I would like to share that experience with you. The experiences of looking at something beautiful.
Nice.
Now I could show you what it is that I'm looking at. And you might be convinced that I've shared the experience with you and you would be fooled.
Right.
I would be giving you your experience of an image of the thing that I'm looking at. But even if I could bring you to my side and point at the thing, that would still not give you my experience of it.
Well, maybe there's a chink.
What do you think?
Well, if we were standing side by side, or let's just do the experiment live now, you know, it's like this moment. Is this moment my experience or your experience or our experience?
Or everybody's experience?
Right. So these are all framings. And in a sense, what I think it's really interesting to sort of feel into each one of those.
Mm.
So if you're
Yeah.
into,
We'll need to go slower if you want to give me time to actually like really feel each.
yeah, no, let's do it again. So like I always think of what's his name? Who wrote Infinite Jest?
David Foster Wallace.
David Foster Wallace. So
I
David
haven't read
Foster
it, but
Wallace.
I know that I know the symbol mapping. I can do the autocomplete.
Right. Very good. Yeah, that's very helpful. There's a brilliant short story he wrote about a guy who ultimately commits suicide. And I mean, David Foster Wallace also committed suicide. So it's kind of, there's something obviously very personal in it. And his ultimate reason for committing suicide is the sense that the world which is in him, in his head, he cannot ever communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So because like, and this connects to Elon Musk in a funny way, and Neuralink. So one of the reasons
Oh,
that
yeah. Okay.
he wants to make Neuralink is he says our bandwidth is too low, right? The bit rate for getting information in and out of this skull is too low, right? Because we have text, we have thumbs, or maybe typing, maybe we have speech. So he's seeing information input and output as being basically words, right? I think this is, and David Foster Wallace.
Yeah. Okay, hang on. I'm yeah. I'm piecing this together with a few other things. Yeah. Can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
Okay, so part of it seems to me like one of the big puzzles that you come up with when you try to do first person plural science, like, is that when I meditate, there's a sense in which like I might be a bit compartmentalized. Might actually be quite compartmentalized, but there's a sense in which all of my parts have been there for the same 30 some years of my life and have seen all the same shit. Mm-hmm. If you and I try to sync up, whatever that means, but let's say it's something like meditating, we have completely different contexts. Well, not completely. We're interesting, right? And so it's like, okay, there's a bunch of things that we have as shared context because same universe. There's a bunch of things we have as shared context because same species. Yes. We also have more memes in common than I expected us to have. I have discovered in the course of this conversation. I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah, McGilchrist and Don Hoffman. This is great. That was good. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. And that's been satisfying. And so it's like, okay, well, we actually do have a bunch of stuff in our syncing up space. We probably also have some shared experiences from having done things like meditate or interpersonal practice or whatever other kinds of things. And, we've hung out on the same Twitter sphere, blah, 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 blah. So having said that, we may still also have vast gulfs where, you had something really violent happen to you when you were young and I didn't. And so part of you contains this strong sense of like, people are not trustworthy in this particular way that like I don't have, for instance. And it might be that doesn't even come up for a while, but then if it does, it's going to be like, whoa, what's this weird disjoint that we're having? Yeah. Jumping a little bit from that, I've really enjoyed thinking of the metaphor of like when two people try to like drop in together and sort of do collective consciousness, collective perception, collective sense making and meaning making, etc. There's something about that's a little bit like how it's like the two people have different perspectives, both in like they are live experiencing different sensory things, and they're also like they have different contexts that they're bringing to it. When I look at my lover, I see my lover. You see, oh, there's a person. Never met that person or whatever. You have some other interpretation when you see that person. So we have these different perspectives, and the perspectives include things like, generalizations about ways in which the world is safe and not, and what's possible and what isn't possible, and all of that kind of thing. And those perspectives are different. And one erroneous thing, which is very related to the law of the excluded middle, is to say, well, which one's right? We're having an argument to find out who's right, who is correct in this argument. Or do we need to compromise? And, is the truth somewhere in between? some weird average. And it's like, instead, I've started thinking about eyes. And it's like, okay, my left eye, my right eye have a slightly different view of the world. If I hold up my finger right here, my eyes disagree about which side of your face my finger is on, or which side of my finger your face is on, which, I can make it seem more like one or the other depending on which I focus on. And wrapping this back around, pulling it back to that image of me bringing you next to the sunset that I'm looking at, it occurred to me that I was thinking about this eyes metaphor, and I was thinking about how disorienting it would be to and this is a sort of a weird thought experiment. I'm probably suspicious of it if I pause, just like I am of all thought experiments. But suppose that some weird Neuralink shit happened, and me and somebody down the street suddenly had our brains linked up in such a way that there was one sense-making system that was trying to make sense of both sets of sensory input. This would be very disorienting, obviously. It would be like, okay, I'm in a room. No, I'm on a street. Suppose the other guy's walking down the street. It's like, but what's okay? And then like the Malcolm parts of the system would be like, well, that street is sure close to where I live. Hang on. I'm getting sense perceptions from out in the street. Well, maybe let's go out in the street and find that whoever else's eyes I'm looking at. And then I would go find that person, and hopefully they would do the same, right? And then we would go stand next to each other and look in the same direction and be like a baby, calibrating its eyes so that it can sort of form a common sense of what its sense fields are doing. And then from there, we might try, okay, what happens if we like step a few feet apart? Whoa, shit is suddenly depth perception is dramatically magnified. Wow, okay. Let's just chill with that for a moment. Okay. And right, major parallax. And eventually we might learn to function while, in totally different rooms while maintaining this like brain connection. Although it would be difficult. I mean, it would be very difficult and whatever. But even functioning at all would at least first require coming together and like recalibrating. Like, yes, we're in the same world. Okay, yeah, it looks like that. Oh, wow, you're colorblind. Okay, that's kind of trippy. That explains why the mountain looks sort of red when it's usually green. Like, all of that kind of stuff. And so what I'm taking from that is I made a connection to that and the thing you described of like, well, if we were next to each other and you were like, check out the sunset, there's a way in which I might have something like the experience you're having, not just because, and I'm going to pause it, not just because you are happening to look at the sunset, but because you're experiencing me pointing at it. And we are in that moment communing in relation to the sunset. Like I've directed not just your attention to it, but I've directed our attention to it. And my attention is part of that. And so we would be having an experience that necessarily has something in common with my experience. And in order for that to be true, you would need to also be having an experience that has something in common with my experience.
Right. So the way I come at this is more like trying to notice when I am sort of unconsciously imposing frames on experience, like saying my experience is already a kind of framing, right? So the thing is that sense of my experience is so deeply assumed, and I'm speaking for myself here, whatever that means.
Is this also the like relative absolute thing?
Yes, in a sense. Yeah, it can be. What's interesting about the relative absolute is I think that we have to, my teacher would draw a Z or a Z, right? So it's like, here's the ultimate truth, or here's the historical, we start with the historical on top. you know, in which everything, I'm outside of you, you're outside of me, we're separate, you know. And then the ultimate truth is there, but there's a way to go along the, you know, the diagonal, to move smoothly from the relative or the historical to the ultimate. And that's practice, in a sense. That's meditation, you know, and there's so many different ways to do that. So if we come back to this sense of kind of like, let's do a first person experiment, I want to look, really look with as much openness as possible at the nature of this experience, whatever it is. I'm not going to call it my experience. I can just call it this experience.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And when I look, so this is related to a practice which is I really, really like. With another name I don't remember. I never remember this guy's name. There's an old English guy who died recently. He's called The Wisdom of No Head.
Oh yeah, Douglas Traherne Harding.
Harding.
Yeah.
Douglas Harding. You got it. Okay. So when I look, right, so in my normal way of looking, I'm looking out as though I'm here and my experience is somehow out there.
Right.
But what he invites us to do, and you can do it if you like, you point, right? So you have your finger and you point towards the thing that you appear to be looking at, and your attention is outward, right? And then he says, okay, so you keep looking, you don't move the direction of your eyes, but you move the direction of your attention. So you're still looking out, but you're actually looking backwards along the line of your gaze, in a sense, to what it is that you're actually seeing in here. And what he says is like, what we're told is that there is this sort of dark blob of goop, right, which is a brain and blood, and it's in a bony, scully thing, right? But when you actually look back into your own experience, what you find is all of that. When I look into me, what I see is you, not me. I don't see like this dark box of skull. What I see is the world. And it seems to emanate from a kind of point at nowhere. And it keeps manifesting endlessly with colors and shapes. And it's always novel and new and interesting. And it just keeps like pouring forth with absolute clarity. And if I ask like, what is me and what is you? I can't really find those two things, right? I can't see any real separation between those. Like, I would not be manifesting in this way if you were not there. There's a kind of, I am because you are in this moment, right? I'm saying these things now and having the feelings that I'm having and the experiences that I'm having because you're there and because you've said the things that you've said.
Right. I just got a little taste of that right now.
Okay.
Like I felt a sense in which you're saying, like we could have the phrase, you're saying these things to me.
Yes.
And that's like a description of a thing that is occurring. We could also have the phrase, I want a better word than hearing, but like I'm hearing, listening to you say these things.
Yeah.
And I almost want a verb that puts your speaking into my subject. Do you see what I mean here?
Yes, exactly.
We don't quite have one. But it's like
you're calling forth.
Yes, like I'm
sound. Yeah.
It's like I could almost experience my own agency in your speech.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually what's happening in the best kind of conversation. That there's this absolute fluidity and interdependence, and it's not woo-woo kind of like, I don't know, it's like you can taste it, but our ability to taste it, to experience it, to feel that little glimmer of, hang on, whoa, oh, that was very different, is directly or maybe inversely proportional to our dependence on hidden assumptions like I'm here and you're there, I am me and you are you, right?
Huh.
The thing is, those assumptions are so strong that usually they just determine our experience fully.
Right. And then sometimes they fall away, not because we've done anything sort of interesting, metaphysical, introspective, phenomenological stuff, but you just got two mathematicians talking and they've forgotten about everything except the math. They've forgotten they even have bodies, but they're communing with the structures together. And eventually they're like, man, I gotta go pee.
Yeah, right.
They don't lose track of their own bodily signals, but they're sort of like they're just lost in the process of thinking together.
They're vibing, it's
just vibing.
So it's kind of like, in a sense, like from another perspective, that's all that's ever happening
is vibing.
Yeah.
I gotta put that on a t-shirt. Baflin says, from some perspective. Well, so I have another question though. Like when I start to take this seriously, it comes up. I almost want to say against, and that's an interesting choice of word, but it's the word that's arising, so I'll say it while acknowledging that. It seems true to me. Like I'm thinking about what you said earlier about seems. So I'm like, but seems feels like a really necessary word for some of this stuff, because part of what we're talking about is like, okay, there are things that can be true and people haven't noticed them.
Yeah.
Or something, right? So it's like, it is meaningful for me to say that seems true to me, because you could imagine trying to do this with somebody and they're like, I don't get it. That seems dumb, right? And like, that's a meaningful piece of information. So I'm going, okay, this seems true. And it also, I have this other truth, which maybe I'm sort of like attempting to kind of bring the paradox in contact with itself, which is something like that.
There are parts of you that I don't know and parts of me that you don't know. And
something like that, right? So I'm curious, like, pardon?
The occluded, the hidden. And that brings us back to his name who wrote Infinite Jest. What's his name again? David Foster Wallace.
Yeah.
Whose whole suffering was, you can never know my experience. I can never know your experience. Right. And then no matter how many books I write, I couldn't tell you my experience.
Yeah. And it sounds like his particular fragment of everything got sort of hung up on a particular version of that he wanted, that maybe isn't possible.
And a means of communicating it.
Oh, well, books, for instance.
Well, or just words, language.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that brings us back to Elon Musk and the bitrate problem, because he's like, you got to have Neuralink because you need faster bitrate. And I'm just like, well, no.
That's a faster bitrate than what? Do you need faster bitrate than words? Yes.
Yes.
Can you get that without Neuralink? Also, yes.
Yes. But do you have already faster bitrate? Yes, you have infinite bitrate.
So there I'm like, what?
Yes.
So yeah, that doesn't scan to me at all.
You have infinite bitrate because there is no separation between you and the cosmos, whatever is not you. These are not two things.
So there's no separation between, like, okay, interesting. Okay, I can see I can see why you're taking concern with data as a concept, right, and why you were critiquing my use of information theory earlier. Right. Interesting. Okay, yeah. So that's all still relatively true. Like, there's a pragmatic sense in which I don't have infinite bitrate.
Well, in the historical dimension, yes, I'm completely with you. See, there's two truths, and they're okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Both true.
Hang on.
I'm not saying.
Give me a moment here. Give me a moment.
Yeah, please. But I'm never saying that the historical is less true.
I love that. Yeah. Okay. Infinite bit rate. Well, okay, but bit rate is invoking information theory.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
So in that sense, like it's begging the question a little bit, or like assuming there's a little bit of a inherent, but there is maybe what you mean to say is you, in some sense, you do not have. In some sense, there is a sense in which communication is not limited by bit rate. Like by putting the negative in a different part of the sentence. Yeah, it's not that there's bit rate, which is infinite. There is something beyond bit rate.
There is no bit rate. There is no spoon.
Only then will you realize the truth. There is no bit rate.
But it's kind of the same thing, right?
Although ironically, no, because like in the Matrix, like they're
all data. Yeah,
it is all data, right? Like it's, you know, and there is
but it's, if you see the Matrix as metaphor, it's okay.
Right. It's like the truth that you're realizing in both cases is the non-separateness or something.
Yes, and they just happen to rely on the best metaphor we had at the time, which is simulation. Right? But it's ultimately, it's a mythic story.
Yeah, totally.
We're just using modern language to tell an old story.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's still something I'm confused about here, though. This has been a good arc.
Before you say what you say, like keep it. But I just want to come back to one thing earlier, which is because you made this nice kind of depiction of like what is the shared and what is the not shared between us, right? So we have a sort of shared meme space to a large degree. We have, shared world, cosmos, even evolutionary history, very greatly shared. And then there's life history that's pretty different. Like we've only just met in a sense, maybe we met a couple of times before online, but we haven't really spent much time together. So there's like all kinds of things I don't know about you, maybe all kinds of things you don't know about me, or you don't know the things that happened to me historically, right?
And even if I did know them as a story, I might not know the significance of them and the generalizations you made from them and so forth. Keep going.
You could have read, I might have written an autobiography and you could read it, but it wouldn't, that would be the limited bit rate, right? David Foster's version, right? But something I came across recently was actually a quote from Lynn Margulis, which it just hit me. It was so beautiful. She said, everything that is in this present moment, everywhere throughout the whole cosmos, is equally evolved.
Oh yeah, I love that. I was making such a point yesterday, actually. Yeah. It's like even ferns, they've been evolving the whole time.
Yes. Yes. There's no like more advanced or less advanced. It's like everything. And and so it's a very short step from that to seeing the entire history of the cosmos in the present moment. So let's take a subcase, right? A subset of that. Let's take this face, right? You're seeing a face over here. My history, although maybe you couldn't like tell me explicitly what it is somehow written here. It's in my muscles, it's in my facial expressions, it's in my mannerisms, it's in my my hesitation, my way of speech. Like it's all here. If anything had not happened to me, if we tried to remove some part of it, I would not be showing up like this in this moment. Right?
I've come at this from a few different angles, and one that I really enjoyed is I was listening to a meditation that a friend made, and she was saying like, it's sort of an affirmation meditation, whatever. I was just curious to find out what it was. And she was like, you are perfect just as you are. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be subtracted. And I was like, you can't even add or subtract from a person. That's a type error. Like that's like you have to put it somewhere.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
you,
What are
you
you
know,
taking out? What are you putting in? Yeah. I mean, so the whole, so basically, like, it's just a new pair of glasses, right? It's another lens, and we can look at this moment. Again, it's like it's an experiment, right? We're in a lab, and what we have is all sensory modalities, not just the visual field, but the whole of this. Yeah, there you go. You got the new lenses, Mark II.
yeah.
So what you have under a certain framing, right? The usual one is I'm here. My experience is sort of like roughly located in this center of this sort of cranial box of bone, and it's a simulation of something which I can never actually touch, but sort of I abstractly believe in the existence of an external physical world which my senses are imperfectly recreating in an internal simulation, and and I'm using predictive coding to navigate it.
Well,
And
and all of that, like all of that is the conceptual frame on top of it. We also just have our pragmatic experience of like knowing how to walk down the street and stuff like that,
okay,
and the
yeah,
sort of pragmatic assumptions we're making about what sort of thing I am and
right,
others are,
right.
and so
So
forth.
we're inferring all kinds of things based on this sort of
Yeah,
heuristic navigation of the world,
yeah.
and accumulation of regularities, and things like that. So that's all, and there's so many different ways you could frame that. But what I'm inviting is this other kind of like, okay, just suspend all of that and just look at it again, as though it's almost like a topological thing. It's just this sort of richly textured surface which isn't a surface, right? It's a surface that has depth and is multimodal, but it's like the rawness of just experiencing of everything. It contains implicit in it the entire everything of everything that happened before, if for a moment we believe in time. Okay, so if there is such a thing as the past, all of everything gave rise to this moment. If you change
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
anything,
yeah, 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 yeah.
right, even like an electron, would go through one slit in the grating rather than the other, it would not have given rise to this moment. This moment would be different somehow. So the bandwidth,
I actually have questions about that.
yeah,
Like,
okay,
well, I mean, specifically, I thought that part of the whole point of like the word quantum is pointing at there is a minimum size of change needed or something for something to sort of count.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I think,
But maybe the electron going through the different slit is above that minimum size. Like maybe that's part of the point,
as
or the
far as I
photon
know,
rather.
as far as
So
I know,
I'm not actually sure. Yeah.
yeah, I
I
think
don't
it's,
understand any of that
I mean,
particularly well.
I think maybe some physicists would disagree with me, because you could, even without going into quantum mechanics, even even in a kind of Newtonian world, you could talk about damping and sensitive dependence on initial conditions. You could sort of say, well, most things, are sort of damped away and averaged
Right,
out.
right. There's a sense in which, if I put some electrolyte powder in my water and like mix it up, it's like even if it had been mixed slightly differently, it's like it's going to get mixed again when I drink it. Like it's the some butterfly wing flaps become actual noise and sort of don't make their way
Exactly.
anywhere.
That's all kind of conjectural. Like, we don't actually know to what extent the universe has sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Like, we don't know how many of the tiny interactions cascade into larger phenomena. Like, we still don't know much about that.
I mean, it's sort of, I mean, if we want to get really serious about this, it sort of feels to me like you could construct an experiment in which like you sort of deliberately destroy information or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, I don't even think you have to think that hard about that. It's like if you like if you have a program on your computer that sort of randomly deletes a file either at this millisecond or the next millisecond, like it might be that the computer's state is identical after those two.
Right.
And it doesn't keep any record of which it did, and that like literally there is no place anybody could check. even in principle. I don't know, right? But like, and so in that sense, like, yeah, you actually have not sort of split universes if you're going with many worlds theory, or you've not like, I don't know, something like that.
I think the two, yeah, I don't know. Again, we're kind of like dancing between a physicalist,
yeah.
right? Because all of these thought experiments do basically rely on a physicalist underpinning, and we don't know quite how those thought experiments translate into a non-physicalist universe. But what I'm saying is it's maybe not so important really which is which. It's just the sense that the whole history of the cosmos is here.
I think something that's even more important, like sort of going in the opposite direction from the physicalist stuff. It's like, suppose that I see on your face a kind of peace. That's somehow the output of your history.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't necessarily know whether that peace comes from something more like you had a very peaceful upbringing and you've always been peaceful, or you had a peaceful childhood and then something really fucked up happened to you in your 20s, and I would have seen a lot of tension on your face if I'd met you after that, but then like you sort of worked through that, or whether in fact like something like I don't, there's stuff I don't know, but something like if you are carrying tension, there's a sense in which that is going to be somehow affecting your face.
You think it has more information?
Well, it's not that the tension has more information. The thing I'm trying to point at is something like, if you had childhood stuff and resolved it, whatever I mean by that, there's a sense in which I might not see it on your face. And from my perspective, it would be as if it didn't happen to some degree, perhaps.
Can I draw a distinction between explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge here?
Oh, I'm referring to the implicit, to be very clear. Like,
well, are you though? Because if you're kind of trying to infer from my face now what may or may not have happened, you're kind of taking from this and trying to get some explicit knowledge, which might not be possible. So I go with you there.
Yeah,
you might not be able to tell the difference between some traumatic thing that happened to me as a child, and which I then, integrated in some way. Or
maybe let's make a much simpler statement. Something like, suppose that we got on this call today and actually you'd gotten a really upsetting, message about a family member dying just before we got on the call, and you decided, hey, I'm going to get on the call anyway. Yeah. I might see on your face that you were experiencing grief or distress or whatever it might be. And I would also see something about how you're relating to that.
Yes.
And what I would be seeing, the fact that I would be seeing that would be in some sense in part because it's relevant. Like it's relevant to now. The grief that you were experiencing months ago is less relevant to now and is sort of less present on your face in some sense, unless it becomes relevant because something I say touches back on it or whatever. Do you see what I'm trying to point at here? I'm trying to point at something about how like it's actually something about the brilliance of everything, about how I'm trying to make a case for the bandwidth being like pragmatically more like infinite. It's like I'm pointing at how your face and my perception are doing a bunch of relevance stuff already. The fact that we are in this conversation is not a coincidence either, of course.
Yeah, there's a lot in that as well, implicit.
Yeah. And relevance. Yeah. So there's something about that. And what I consciously notice is also not going to be a coincidence. Like out of the things I sort of could have noticed, there's like a whole bunch of systems that are tracking what seems to be important to me, given everything that happened to me.
Right.
Yeah.
But all of these perceptions and the ways in which we can conceive of them, even, are dependent on the degree of tightness of views about self and individuality and separation. Right. So there's basically, we can move up and down that diagonal, and we're doing it all the time.
Mhm.
Right. So there's going to be moments when we suddenly sort of feel like, oh, hang on, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then moments that where it's more just a experience that we're having together, whatever
Yeah.
that means, of
Co-arising
co-thinking
of,
and co-sensing and whatever. Yeah.
and so the accessibility of that sort of vibing, just like co-arising, I think is again kind of inversely proportional to the strength of the presence of a self view.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if the self view releases or relaxes for a moment, or it's suspended, or it's just released completely, then this kind of like, woo, what is going, this kind of magical, mystical, there is a co-arising of something which I don't even know how to name, becomes available. But we can very quickly also slip back into, but I'm me, and I have a name, and I have a passport and a birth certificate and a history, and you have yours. And so these things, again, are not mutually exclusive.
No.
Both are true, but they are accessible dependent on the presence of quite deeply ingrained belief systems.
So
And
it
language
seems
is also messing with us in very important ways. Like language is conditioning and framing the availability of experience, or the very nature of experience. So because we are so used to coupling our experience with language, and in fact in sort of narrating our experience to ourselves, to telling ourselves what is happening, then, and so to the degree that we do that, our perception then becomes constrained by the terms of language, right? Like you and me.
Mm-hmm.
But to the degree that we can get into a non-verbal sort of direct experiencing of sensing, which I think meditation training ultimately can make that more and more available, this sort of stopping of the internal narration, then other types of experience become available, which are so wildly different that it's kind of impossible to talk about them. Like the words don't fit, like they don't line up. The words push you down other routes and make other things salient.
And yet, so are you still talking about like collective experience?
Yeah.
So there's a collective recognition of we are having an experience that could be described in words. I shouldn't say a collective recognition of words as if the recognition is made of words, but there is a collective recognition of something
which can be pointed to
with words.
Yeah.
And that something is being recognized by the collective. Yeah.
So my teacher
I'm
was
still
really,
baffled about like how that fits with. Well, no, I not that specifically, but I still have some sort of bafflement about the role that individual perspectives play in this. And I have, I guess, one theory that I've been working on, which I can lay out, I think, quite in brief, and sort of hear what you think of it. So, or something. See how it does. See how it vibes. Yeah. So a little kind of story or parable or something. Suppose that you and I are on a canoe trip, and it's a short canoe trip. We're just kind of going out. Well, it's a a 1 day kind of deal. So we're not camping or anything, but we're out for the day, and suppose that we're quite far out, and I drop my sandwich in the water. Now, I imagine you would probably want me to get to have half of your sandwich.
Definitely.
Right. I've yet to tell this story to anybody who's like, nah. And one thing that I've noticed is that if I were to ask for your sandwich, or half of your sandwich, or like suppose I were to express to you, like, hey, I dropped my sandwich. I sure hope you're going to give me half of yours.
Yeah, an expectation.
Right. I bet it makes you kind of less, like, you might still give me half, but you're not as into it.
Yeah.
On the converse, if I were like, oh, I dropped my sandwich, I guess I'll just have to be hungry all day because there's no food for me. Like,
that might make me want to push you out of the boat.
Right. Like you may still give me half the sandwich, but it feels worse now, right?
Yeah, I'll push you out of the boat first and then give you half the sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if I am a monk. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't push you out of the boat.
It's a question of what counts as violence, but anyway, so
there's scope for playfulness, I think.
Right. Yes. There's clearly finite and context-free answers to such questions. But let's not waste time trying to find what they are. So what's going on here is sort of just the question. And then I've got my frame for what's going on with this.
Yeah.
You're welcome to say some things if you want, or I can just kind of lay out my.
I mean, I would put it very briefly, which is it's National Geographic. It's like it's mammalian. What's going on? My sandwich, your sandwich. It's very, very primal, and it's sensitive. Fairness, there's this wonderful experiments that they did with macaques who are in separate. I mean, it's not nice that they're in glass boxes, but I think these are not badly treated macaques. I mean, it's to the extent that they're not in the wild, they're being badly treated. But
yeah, so are we.
Yeah, right. We're also living in boxes, and but they do things like to test the sense of fairness.
So and if you pay one macaque in grapes, the other won't take payment in cucumbers because they're like,
hey, what about
buddy got grapes for that?
Exactly. But then if you don't give one, there's another form of it where if one of them doesn't get grapes, then the other one won't even eat his grape because he's like, but he didn't get a grape. So
right. So right. And maybe what that's pointing at is like, I don't want to be favored. I'm gonna get a beating later if I'm favored, is like another could be. But could also be a sense of indignance on behalf of, depending on whether they're sort of identified with each other or not, or something like that.
There's different, like, more or less generous interpretations of it. But
right.
I think that's what's happening there.
Yeah.
Sandwich.
Right.
We're doing very old programming there.
So I'm going to lay out my framing, which I don't actually know to what degree it sort of is confluent with yours. Like I'm unclear on it. So my lens is that something like what's happening is that at the moment when I initially dropped my sandwich in this story, as I've constructed it, people are experiencing a sense of unity with each other. The canoe evokes, we are in this together.
Yes.
And quite literally, you're like, well, we've got to get back together.
Same boat.
Right? We are literally in the same boat. And what happens in the mode where I get either aggressive or passive aggressive is I am severing that unity.
Yep.
What I'm saying is either in the first case, something like, I don't trust you to feed to, I don't trust you. I don't trust us
Yes.
It's almost an I don't trust us to get me fed, so I need to take matters into my own hands and
Well, it's a
demand.
sudden identification of, it's a kind of declaration of there is no us.
Yes, precisely that. Meanwhile, the passive aggressive one is maybe, I mean, it depends on the situation, but maybe something more like, oh, I'm so desperate to keep a sense of us that I'm going to negate my own needs.
Yeah, right.
Which is sort of saying there is an us and it sucks.
Yeah. Or it's a fear of maybe there isn't us. What if there wasn't us?
Right. Yeah. But it's the us that you're in is no longer the kind of us that takes care of itself. It's the kind of us that does
negotiate and
right.
Yeah.
At which point there's some desire on the other person's part to sort of say, well, I don't want to. I no longer want to give you some of my sandwich. I thought we were just going to share the sandwich we have left. But now that you've made it all weird, like, so there's this kind of
like you eject both people from
right. And I think that maybe the word for this thing is ego. And so there's this thing where ego in one person tends to evoke ego in another person.
Nice.
It's possible, of course, you just kind of named an example of like, if you did that second thing, I would like push you in the water and then I'd be like, also have some sandwich, right? Which is sort of a way of being like, hey, buddy, like, what are you doing? Yeah. Get back in us mode. Like, I'm totally going to give you some sandwich. What are you worried about, right? Like, there's a kind of, you are staying in touch with the sense of us while playfully sort of responding to me and trying to like help me get back into it or something. And there might be similar, I mean, I'm certain that there are in general similar responses to the aggressive version.
Yeah.
That would be also sort of playful and would hold the thing and sort of welcome and invite back into the sense of us.
Probably give you the whole sandwich.
Right. Like it's, or something. I mean, but even there, it depends on how you do that.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's a really good thought experiment, and I think it extends to community really well. So I could tell you so many stories. I mean, so you got to imagine me, right? I'm gonna now give you some history, okay? So we'll fill in some of the blanks here with this
with some words,
this appearance.
Well, and some vibes.
Yeah, right. It's all vibes. So I guess to paint a little sketch is I'm a product in a way of the scientific materialist worldview. My whole education was essentially individualistic. Like if I think back and ask myself, what was I really trained for by my education? And mostly I believe what I was trained for was to compete. If I think about everything that I learned, it was always directed towards exams, passing exams. Those exams I took alone. All of the exams were taken alone. Right? It's a very, very weird situation.
Yeah.
None of my life experience post-exams, post-university, has involved doing anything really alone to the degree that I was alone in the exams. Isn't it amazing? Like none of my training actually lines up with what I needed to do, which was to be able to cooperate, to work together, to share ideas, to vibe, right? I was trained to pretend that I am this little unit and I've got to survive and kind of defend myself and prove myself. And ultimately I have to be the best. I have to be the smartest guy in the room. I have to be the fastest. I have to,
And sometimes they'll even, they'll do grading by curve and it'll be like, all right, 10% of you are going to fail.
Yeah.
No matter how well all of you do. Which
explicitly a competition.
Right. Which is bonkers. Like it's bonkers for a few reasons. But anyway, I don't think we even need to go into that. We could have a rant about that, but yeah.
Exactly. But let's just sort of take that as read. Okay. So you've got this, very individualistically trained young person, young mammal, and you know, doing his best in a strange world. And nobody has ever really even suggested the possibility that there might be some other way of conceiving of
Mm-hmm.
I am or what I am or what my function is, right? Like everything is directed towards you have to be the best you can be, you know, you have to be smart, you have to, you know, get a good grades and then go to a good school and then go to another good school and then get more good grades and then get a good job and make good money and get a good reputation, what career, whatever, all of that stuff. Or even as an artist, you know, you have to prove yourself, you have to be great, you have to be successful, you have to have great ideas. And then I run into this place called Plum Village, right, which is a monastery in the southwest of France. And I go there essentially mainly because my mother died when I was 18, and it was unexpected, it was sudden, and I was, you know, in my scientific kind of hubris, I was just like, you know, she is just the product of brain activity, and activity ceases, that's it, she's gone, it's all over, and it doesn't mean anything because nothing means anything, and I don't feel anything because why should I feel anything?
Wouldn't do any good anyway.
Yeah, and you know, and I would go into shops and the shopkeepers would be like, "Oh, you look so sad. What's wrong?" I'd be like, "What do you mean? I'm not sad. I'm fine. What are you talking about?" So it was literally written on my face.
Right.
But I was so dissociated from my own body and my own feelings that I could not feel it. I did
Right.
not
You weren't
understand.
lying when you said, no, I'm fine.
Of course I was lying. Of course I was lying. I
Well,
was profoundly not fine.
I
But
said you weren't lying.
well, no, from the point of view of
point of
my
view
little
of the ego
narration,
asserting its desire to be okay.
the feelings were just like not present to me. They were there, but I couldn't feel them. So in a sense, I wasn't lying. Yeah.
Well, although this gets back to the thing about like what voice was speaking.
Yeah.
Like, it was not the grief saying I'm fine.
Right.
Some other part was saying this whole person, am fine. Nothing to see here.
The one who has apparently sort of taken control of the ship.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But he's really not in control. And of course, all the time, all the while, you know, something was whispering in my ear and in my bones and in my flesh, you know, that something was amiss. And so I was seeking. At the same time, I was seeking. And, you know, randomly, whatever that means, you know, somebody started talking about this person called Thich Nhat Hanh and said, oh, he's enlightened. And, you know, and I was kind of like, you know, dabbling a little bit with some psychedelic experiences, and had a tape of Ramdas that I listened to obsessively, you know, in the middle of the night. And I was kind of like, what if there is more? And I read Hermann Hesse.